Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Robert Colville. I'm the director of the Centre for Policy Studies, and with me is an extremely distinguished panel to discuss the issue of free trade, and in particular to explore the idea that trade is no longer just about between nations, but between places, that the flows of trade. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Hang on. I'm Robert Colville. I'm the director of the Centre for Policy Studies. Right. Well, we are definitely streaming because YouTube has helpfully started repeating my words back to me. Excellent. The CPS is we're hosting this panel with GENN, the Global Economic Neural Network, set up by Shankar Singham, one of our panelists and one of the leading trade commentators in the UK. And obviously, trade is an issue which is fantastically important to us at the CPS. Before everything happened, we were planning to have our annual Margaret Thatcher conference at the Guildhall on the issue of trade, which was going to take place next week, but alas, no. Likewise, Rishi Sunak's Free Ports proposal was something that he developed with the CPS, and that we've been supporting for several years. So this is an extremely exciting event. And I will now stop talking and hand over to our panel. Shankar, I've mentioned. We also have Georgina Wright of the Institute for Government, Lars Carlson of KTH Global Consulting, who is the former head of Swedish Customs and director of the World Customs Organization, and Frank Dunsmuir of Fujitsu, who is another person who knows practically everything there is to know about how the world's trade systems work and how we can make them work better. In a Twitter debate before this, we promised to use the word turbocharging repeatedly. I will hand over to Shankar and let him accept that challenge.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I'll endeavour to turbocharge the conversation. I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about is the global context for this discussion we're having. I mean, essentially what we're having now is as we come out of the COVID pandemic, there is going to be a significant requirement for private sector economic growth. Governments are going to have unsustainable debt levels. And so how are we going to generate that economic growth? There is a national or international element of this, which is obviously covered by external trade policy, trade agreements, multilateral institutions like the WTO and the Bretton Woods institutions. And it's very important that all of those are moving forward and liberalizing the world. In that context, for the UK, obviously we have the UK's external trade policy agenda, which is, as Liz Truss, the Secretary of State for Trade, has talked about, the US agreement, the accession to the CPTPP, Australia, New Zealand, Japan agreements. The CPTPP is very important because it's a significant regional network that is one of the most advanced regional networks that there is, based on regulatory cooperation and competition and mutual recognition, as opposed to the sort of EU model, which is one of regulatory harmonization. So we have these things going on in the UK, the UK's trade policy. We have countries that will need to ensure that their regulatory systems and their economic systems are pro-competitive and remove behind the border barriers and market distortions from them. We also, and this is what's interesting about this particular discussion and the work we're doing at GENN, is increased focus on subnational developments and economic development opportunities. And you mentioned, Robert, the Freeport agenda and Rishi Sunak's work with CPS, and obviously he's now the Chancellor here in the UK. The Freeport agenda is an opportunity, I think, for the UK to turbocharge its entrance into this kind of world. We have a world of global supply chains, global value chains, nodes and networks on these value chains that are connected by trade highways. And the countries that will succeed are the ones that have the most or more than their fair share of those nodes networks. And there is an emerging sort of Premier League of these places. Now, there are many of these places that we know, the kinds of global cities like London and New York and so on. And to some extent, the more recent ones like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. But there is this developing Premier League, and I think governments are going to have to be very creative and understand that they are in a deep competition to get into that Premier League. So we know that pandemics accelerate existing trends, whether that's AI or 3D printing, blockchain technology, movement of people through flexible labor markets, what Ricardo Hausmann has talked about, the movement of brains as opposed to tradable commodities. And we know that in order to get into this kind of Premier League of places, of cities, of zones, special economic zones, governments have to ensure that those zones are attractive to global capital. There is a huge amount of even before the pandemic, there was a huge amount of global capital on the sidelines, on balance sheets. There is far more now looking for places to go. And I think what we'll find is as we come out, and there will be, people are going to come out of this at different times and in different ways. And I think that is going to be a significant element of how successful those economies can be. So the countries that have done well on things like track and trace technologies, the ones that have done well on testing, are the ones that are more likely to come out quickly, and they're also the ones that are likely to manage a second wave of COVID a lot better. And that may have some distorting effects around the world. So obviously London and New York have been very badly hit. There are other places that have done very well on testing, like Singapore, like the UAE, which may come out more quickly and may actually be more resilient as a result. But generally, governments want all the benefits of the sort of free port, free zone type agenda, but they're not really prepared often to do the heavy lifting. So one of the things that GENN we're talking about is, what do you need to do to get into this Premier League? And I think that is basically ensure that you have the kind of regulatory framework. It's not all about tax incentives and tax breaks. It's got to be more than that. If it's only tax breaks and tax incentives, the last 15 years have shown that's not enough to attract that global capital. You've got to have regulatory frameworks that promote economic growth and opportunity. And you've got to also ensure that these zones are resilient, that they are safe from illicit trade. One of the problems we've discovered through the pandemic is that we don't have great visibility into global supply chains. So nodes and zones and cities that are able to have that better visibility through things like, and Lars is the expert on this, things like, World Customs Organization, Safe Zone, these sorts of things. That's the kind of thing that these economic centers are going to need to have and need to be able to demonstrate in order to get into that Premier League and take advantage of these global trends that are occurring. But it's going to be quite a ferocious competition. And as we come out, I think there is going to be significant movement of supply chains. Obviously, without getting into the whole debate about onshoring versus where we are with supply chains now, there is significant movement towards onshoring. So again, there will be pressure on these nodes to demonstrate that they're able to show economic value. So it's a very interesting world. One of the reasons that we launched the GENN project was because we think that this is going to be a significant area of potential economic gain and growth for the global economy, that there is an opportunity for these zones and cities to succeed. And I think also because global value chains and the global economy as a whole is more like a complex it's more like a complex living organism, which is why it's so difficult to model it, and modeling attempts have often not succeeded and not been able to have much predictive power. So for that reason, we wanted to look at the idea of a neural network that's developing amongst all of these global supply chains and all of these global nodes on the supply chains and global cities, which have more in common with each other quite often than they have with the rest of the country in which they are located. And you're creating also a group of people who are comfortable in these places and who move to these places. And they may not be as comfortable in the rest of the country where that node is located. So there's a time of massive change. It's very much an inflection point in the global economy. And I think the UK, coming back to the UK for a moment, has a great opportunity with its free port agenda, with its new external trade policy, to really maximize all of those benefits. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we can add more in the question session.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shankar. I should note that one potential avenue for discussion is obviously this cuts kind of quite hard against the sort of levelling up agenda. Just the idea that there are places which are global hubs and that you need to invest in them. Cuts across the sort of some of the prevailing talk, certainly in the UK. I'll now move on to the responses. Before I do that, I should just say that you should hopefully see a Q&A tab on your screens, and if you have any questions, please do feel free to queue them up as the speakers are speaking. We've already had some submitted via email and others. Rather than throwing to audience members, I'll be trying to sort of moderate and repeat the Q&As questions myself, partly because it's just smoother because we're not sort of dependent on broadband issues, and partly because often the questions tend to overlap, so it's nice to be able to sort of theme them together. Anyway, with that said, I'll hand over to Frank.
Get off mute. Thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here. Just as an introduction to my my preamble, as Robert said, I work for Fujitsu. I'm the industry lead for customs and international trade there, and my role is really to look at how new and emerging technologies can be used in today's global and the future global supply chain to turbocharge the economies. I managed to get turbocharge in there. So we're probably familiar with what those new and emerging technologies are. They're often referred to as Industry 4.0, things like blockchain, Internet of Things, which promise to connect billions of devices, smart devices, creating huge swathes of data, and then the use of artificial intelligence to act on that data and enable us to be informed, make decisions, and automate processes. So it's quite a collection of innovation that's headed our way. Some of it is more mature than others. And this is such a huge topic. I was thinking, how can I crash this down to 2 or 3 minutes? I could easily fill the rest of the session with just the technology aspects here. So I wanted to pick on 3 areas that are typically associated, or 3 attributes that are typically associated with a discussion around global networks or global superhighways, etc., and connected supply chains. And of course, free ports and special economic zones. And we often hear about, well, if we're promoting trade in this sort of way, is it reducing security within that trade? Are we allowing greater non-compliance, etc.? Because we are reducing the barriers to trade, and therefore are we more vulnerable in certain areas? So first of all, how do we establish trust and transparency in the global supply chains? How can technology help with that? Second thing is looking at resilience. Shankar touched on this with COVID-19. And by resilience, I mean the ability to react to challenges and changes, whether be they slow, gradual, or very rapid and catastrophic like COVID-19. And then the third one, which is really important, and particularly around the special economic zone of Freeport agenda, is how can technology actually act as a catalyst for innovation in those areas as well? I think it plays a major role in that aspect as well. So let me touch on those in turn. Firstly, trust and transparency. One of the, if you like, features of global supply chain today is there is an enormous amount of actors involved in moving commodities across the supply chain. So whether it's from China to Europe or or even further afield, there are many routes that product can take, and there are many interfaces where it changes from one hand to another. And the systems and process and data associated with those handoffs don't tend to be connected very well. The immediate ones might be, but from start to finish, they're not. So there's room for, if you like, there's a lack of transparency in the entire supply chain there. So that's kind of an inherent feature of the way the supply chain has grown over the years. But what's emerging in recent years, particularly one of the technology I would highlight here is TradeLens, which is an initiative, a global initiative coming from industry primarily, that is seeking to connect those chains of events. And it's using blockchain technology, because blockchain is highly secure. You can't change the records once they're there. And because it's a common database or common ledger of information, if you've got the right of access to that information, you can see the information you're entitled to from its origin all the way through to its destination. So it's a connected system as well. It's already up and running. It promises to be looking at something like 50% of container freight at the moment. I'm not 100% sure if that is completely accurate, but if I can give you an idea of the impact it's having by a quote from a recent adopter here, which is Indonesia. So the Director General of Customs talked about TradeLens, saying this will help bring further visibility, predictability, and security to us, and be a real asset for trade and transportation facilitation, making Indonesia the perfect logistics and transport gateway in this region. So they've already seen the value of that sort of product, and it's being widely adopted now by many regions. It doesn't have to be TradeLens, there are others, but it needs the power of a global connection in order to make that effective. Once goods are in the port or in the free zone, etc., they still need some sort of monitoring or ability to know where they are, or ability to understand how they're being treated, how they're being used, and how they're then carried forward. And again, I think Schenker touched on this as well. So there are many track and trace technologies that are well out of their infancy now, and using a consistent approach within these zones, we can actually look at tracking and tracing and monitoring, particularly highly secure or valuable items in a very informed way. So all of that aspect, if you like, of the trust and transparency within the supply chain is I think, reaching a very credible maturity now, and needs to be part of a strategy for any free zone. The other one I mentioned was strengthening supply chain resilience. So that's a very difficult thing to do, because if anything changes in the supply chain, to be able to react to it, or an event happens, means you need information about the entire supply chain and all of the actors involved. And again, we come back to the fragmentation that's there today. It makes it incredibly difficult for organizations and institutions to react around that. So the promise of innovation like TradeLens will absolutely help with resilience, no doubt about it. The other one that I would highlight is a concept called single trade window, which Lars will be an expert in this area. It is being adopted by many regions around the world, whether it's at a port level or a national level. And this is the system that connects the processes of the supply chain to governments and port authorities. So it's the fiscal part, it's the carriers, it's things like bills of lading, the customs documentation, and even crew details, etc. So information can be much more freely exchanged and processed in a more automated fashion. And again, there are many case studies of this type of concept providing huge benefits. So all of the leading ports will certainly have single trade window capabilities at some sort or another. And lastly, the one that I would say mustn't be overlooked is actually the port itself, or the region itself, the free port or free zone itself. These are hubs of innovation and hubs of where we should encourage incubation. It's a little bit like the concept of, for me, it's a little bit like the concept of the digital nomads that we know about today. So my son works in Lisbon because he's a digital nomad. He works online. He doesn't have to be in an office anywhere. And as long as that region has got the right infrastructure and the right motivation for those digital nomads and those innovators, it will attract that talent in. So free ports need to think, and special economic zones need to think about their incentives education, how they motivate the introduction of more dynamic innovation from technology organizations and startups, etc. And have they got the infrastructure within the port to do that? So do they have the workplaces that are appropriate for these organizations? Do they have the connectivity? Are they invested in 5G and technologies like that as part of the ways to exploit that sort of area? There's some great work from TUM, the Technical University of Munich, in this area, where they are setting up these sort of capabilities within special economic zones to actively promote and encourage that sort of talent and innovation. And that obviously leads to economic growth within not just the region, but for the nation as well. So in summary, there's three points that I really touched on there is using technology, thinking of technology as a way to really challenge head on that trust and transparency issue, to build resilience, which we now know from our experiences, painful experiences, is absolutely fundamental to future trade. And the third one is thinking of how technology investment in infrastructure in the zones can be used to stimulate economic growth as well. I'll leave it there. I think you're still on mute, Robert.
I am still on mute because my children came in and I wanted to spare you all the sounds of happy little voices. But thank you, Frank. And let me now hand over to Georgina.
Thank you very much, Robert, Margot and Callum, for the invitation, and obviously to all of you for listening in. It really is a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to try and sort of turbocharge some broader thinking about sort of what government should be thinking about when thinking, designing these free ports. For those who don't know, the Institute for Government is an independent, non-partisan think tank that really strives to make government more effective. But prior to that, I was at Chatham House looking at questions of foreign policy and global trade more generally. So I agree basically with what the panelists have said so far and what Robert outlined at the beginning. You know, Brexit is an opportunity, or should be an opportunity, for the UK to do things differently domestically and internationally. And, you know, these are some of the sorts of conversations that we should be having. But obviously, you know, the conversations around free port don't take place in isolation. And so I think if the government really wants to make the most of this, then it will need to make sure it creates an environment that is conducive to that economic activity. So I know I've only got 3 minutes and you've probably got lots of questions, so I'll try and keep my remarks short. But basically, I have sort of 5 things or 5 tips that I would recommend government look into. The first is be creative. So Frank touched upon this, but, you know, stimulate economic activity around free ports. You know, evidence shows that actually, in many cases, the creation of specialized zones has incentivized many companies to just relocate rather than create new employment opportunities. And that, you know, results in a loss of taxpayer revenue. So I think there really needs to be a right balance between tax incentives and other subsidies, but also thinking more holistically about how to stimulate economic activity outside of the zone. So that's, you know, building and designing the area around the port, as Frank was suggesting, infrastructure, apprenticeships and stuff like that. 2 is, you know, don't replace something that works well already. So lots of businesses are already using inward processing relief. So I guess there has to be careful consideration about what added value free ports bring. The third is, do put in place something you said you would do. So I'm specifically here touching on the domestic state aid regime. So I know the Chancellor, well, before he was Chancellor, when he wrote the report, talked about sort of EU state aid rules constraining the UK's ability to make the most of these free ports. And actually one of the sort of arguments that came across very strongly in the report was just how cumbersome it was to, you know, write to the Commission, get a state aid clearance, exemption, et cetera, and so, I mean, my question, perhaps that's a very Institute for Government approach, is, you know, what does that state aid, domestic state aid regime look like? What do those clearances look like? You know, what's the process in place? How would businesses go about it? I think these are the sorts of questions that many businesses are asking clarity on. And of course, the Conservative Party in its manifesto committed to a new domestic subsidy regime. So I think the real question is what that looks like. The fourth tip I would give is sort of think of the broader picture here, and in particular how free ports interact with FTAs. So we know on the 19th of May, the government published its global tariff schedules. But tariff exemptions, in the case of, I think, free ports, only really are of value if global tariffs are otherwise high. So, you know, something the government really needs to think about is, if we're striking FTAs and we're lowering tariffs anyway, then how does that fit with everything else? So I think there are questions there about the interaction of free ports and our free trade agreements and negotiations. And the fifth point, perhaps, is don't lose sight of other sectors and other negotiations. So, you know, I'm thinking about the UK-EU negotiations, but obviously, as was alluded to, the UK-US trade negotiations. But to take one example, manufacturing, I think it was the UK and a Changing Europe published a report this week looking at manufacturing and saying, you know, it's highly integrated with the EU single market and it accounts for 10% of the UK economy. So disruption would have a sizable impact. How do you, you know, think of that alongside all the other opportunities that you want to seize? What does the UK's industrial policy look like? Do we, you know, what does a robust industrial policy look like? And I think there's lots of opportunities here to be creative. And I think it will require a lot of consultation with business as well. And I think credit where it's due, the government has launched a consultation on free ports. And some of the questions I thought were quite interesting on sort of what does a lower tax regime, you know, look like, and interestingly questions around sort of different regulatory regime within these zones as well. So I think these are all important questions. And I think to really be able to seize the opportunities, there needs to be more clarity on detail and what exactly that looks like. So I will leave it there, but happy to come back in the Q&A.
Thank you very much. And now over to Lars.
Yes, thank you, Robert, and good afternoon, everybody. There's no doubt that the pandemic, the COVID-19 corona crisis, have impacted all of us. We are an example of that here today, but obviously also global trade. And there's a lot of theories for the moment about how global trade will change as a result of this specific situation and this crisis. And there's even talk about deglobalization and a lot of other type of trends. I'm not so convinced, though. I do think there will be changes. There will be a focus on moving to some extent from just in time to just in case, where there will be a need for a plan B and for more predictability and compliance in the trade, moving some of the goods closer to markets and so forth. But the underlying trends, the underlying global trends and mega trends will be the same. Globalization will still be there. And we all know that trade recovery will become a very important part of the global recovery from this pandemic and other crises coming afterwards. And I think Free Zone has a really important role to play in that specific arena, in this new normal that actually will appear here in the following weeks and months of this year. And I think that I'm very positive to the UK Freeport agenda, if it's done the right way, if it's leapfrogging to the forefront of the development of free zones and their roles in the international supply chain and global value chains. And there has been and always is, and if we look at specifically the Western world and specifically Europe, some doubts over the use of free ports and free zones over the last 10, 15 years. And there has been merit to that to some extent, that there has been a lack of in some cases, compliance. There have been risks involved, integrity risks involved, and so forth. Mainly because, per definition, they're outside the custom territory, and there's a lack of transparency. But this is about to change. In fact, it has already changed. There is a new type of environment developing, new types of zone, almost a new paradigm of zones actually appearing. And the two major changes is, one, that there are zones that is now applying voluntary compliance, that actually wants to be a part of integrated value chains to much larger extent. And by that will offer a solid and a safe alternative for those companies that actually are compliant and want to also be in an environment of compliance. And Shankar already mentioned, like the World Free Zone Organization Safe Zone Program, which is a compliance program that actually makes the zones more compliant with more integrity, transparency, and good governance, and different types of code of conducts in place for the behavior of the zone and its inhabitants to actually be easier to play a part and a role in the future supply chains of the world. There's also the OECD illicit trade task force initiatives on clean zones, and of course World Customs Organization, United Nations, and so forth are all working in this specific field. And that's the first of the changes of the zones that we see, that there's a number of free zones now that actually meet the requirements, that actually have already taken the development into something that is a different type of zone that we saw before. The other change Frank was touching upon, and that is where we've seen in the emerging world these new type of zones actually developing and already being in place. We also see a link into the Western development and the North development of integrated innovation parks and innovation hubs, where these type of additional services around the free zone becomes more important. And the link of the two makes a very interesting example of how these zones actually could look like in the future, and that some already are, as Shanker was talking about before as well. So from that, we could see that these type of free zones have now eliminated many of the risks that has been involved before. And we can now offer with those type of zones, and if UK actually leads to the forefront of this development, could very easily be a leader in this new type of zones that is emerging. Because the third and important point I want to mention in the initial remark here is that we are now starting to see these zones linking up together. And both all speakers have been talking about it, not only becoming a national and regional and local resource as engines of economy, but also being linked into the international supply chain, into trade superhighways. And that is possible because the technology, as Frank said, is already here. The information management is possible. So when these zones becomes transparent, becomes compliant, there's also an opportunity to use that type of safe and secure technology to actually make sure that the information is available. And that means that we can connect these type of free zones, these special economic zones that not only have the tax incentives, but also have a number of other opportunities from a customs perspective, from a regulatory perspective, but also in the services that was mentioned before, with competence, with different types of links into making sure that there is employment for companies that come in there, that there are people that have the right skills and the competence, that there are different types of side services that actually make that ecosystem and environment a really good place to be if you're a company. And if you then can also feed into a trade superhighway, a global network where these zones become not only nodes, but actually routers of that specific systems. They become not only engines, but also a transformer of that trade to go very quickly, very fast in that Premier League, or I would even say Champions League, that Shanker was talking about. I think there's also an opportunity of inclusiveness in that it's not only the drivers that have made those super cities we see today connecting, all the mega ports connecting, but also new parts in other parts of the regions that can move quicker post-corona to actually be a part of a network like that. And I think for UK, it would be great to be with this new initiative of free ports and free zones, being in the lead of this and also meeting then the requirements that are there to actually be a part and leading this Champions League or Premier League of zones that is connected together in a global network that actually will help trade recovery and recovery after post-corona. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. And we'll move on to the Q&A. I can already tell we're probably not going to make it through all of the questions, but I'll try and group them all together as best I can. And to our panelists, obviously, please don't feel free. You have to chip in. All of you have to chip in on every question, because otherwise we could be here a while. So one sort of theme from the questions is, I mean, obviously. And this is from Tim Morris and Catherine Barbieri and various others have sort of pointed out that, you know, Shanker mentioned regulatory change. So, and this kind of, Georgina mentioned this in her remarks, effectively, the lower tariffs are, the less having a tariff-free port kind of matters. But if you're already thinking of doing opportunity zones, if you're thinking of trying to create special economic zones, especially to revive areas which have been, you know, left behind by growth, which by coincidence happen to be largely where Britain's ports are, you know, that then that's obviously, you know, it's not just about having a free trade zone, it's about having a you know, a whole, yeah, having broader changes too. So the question to the panel is, what should those broader changes be? What regulatory changes do we need to really make, you know, these Premier League hub, to elevate these hubs from Championship to Champions League?
Well, maybe I can have a go at the beginning of that. So I think you've got a spectrum, if you look around the world, of these zones, where on the one hand you have something that's very much like a very sort of pure old style free trade zone with tariff advantages and tax incentives, and that's really it. And what we've learned around the world is that those advantages by themselves do not lead to significant attraction of global capital. So you have a lot of special economic zones around the world that are 20%, 30% occupied. So there has been a sort of learning about this in the last 10, 15 years about what else can you do to position yourself to be an attractor of global capital. And that's where the regulatory piece comes in. And the more you're on that side of the equation rather than the pure tax incentive side of the equation, the more likely the growth you're going to see is sustainable, the more likely you're going to get long-term investment, and the more likely the investors will actually contribute to economic growth in the surrounding region and even the surrounding country. So what you want to avoid is the sort of Intel Costa Rica kind of example, where Costa Rica gave Intel a 20-year tax holiday. The moment the tax holiday ended, Intel immediately left the country, leaving Costa Rica with a huge hole in its budget. So this is to be avoided. But on the regulatory side, there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, Frank mentioned single trade window. This is a single governance structure in terms of doing business and making it easier for people to set up companies, that sort of thing. Particularly for developing countries, that is a huge thing. But if you can offer that, then you will kickstart an enormous amount of economic growth. In the UK specifically, I think it's things like planning. I mean, there are things that we can do on planning where we have recognized problems in the UK economy. So the way to build the regulatory structure is to see where are your problems, where are your regulatory barriers, where are the things that cause problems in the nation. Maybe you can do some experimentation and do some things differently in the zone that as opposed to in the national environment. Now, if you want to look at some zones that have done really big things, now I'm not suggesting that the UK Freeport agenda necessarily has to embrace this sort of level of regulatory change, but if you look at DIFC in Dubai or the Abu Dhabi global market, what they've essentially done in financial services is extraordinary. What they've done is they've said, well, we're going to apply entirely English financial services law, common law, English judges. This is a massive step. And it has succeeded in attracting a lot of capital to those countries. So I think Georgina talked about being creative or encouraging governments to be creative. I think we need to be creative here. We need to look around the world, not limit ourselves to what we think works for the UK, and look at what other people are doing, because some of the things that other people are doing are really transformative. Deal with very difficult issues of domestic law. I mean, one other thing the UK could do on opportunity zones and intellectual property and so on is advance some sort of version of the American Bayh-Dole Act, which is an act that allows universities and small contractors of universities to benefit from patent protection, which creates that the spinning off of companies and universities and so forth that has characterized the US technology space. We can perhaps do some of that in some of our opportunity zones if we allow them also to be innovation zones. And I think if you do, the more of that sort of stuff that you do, the more the leveling up agenda is not negatively impacted by these kinds of developments. That in fact, quite the reverse. What happens is you grow the whole region and you give economic opportunities that frankly would not have come to the country at all but for the zone, and will then spin off opportunities for others.
Thanks, Shankar. Would anyone else like to come in, or should we move on to the next? Lars.
Yeah, yes, a short comment. I agree with what Shankar said. I think there's a number of things you can do. And I also saw there was a question, for instance, about offer economic operator programs, which are compliance programs in itself. So obviously, there are many ways you can actually improve this. And And there's in the international standard, which was a part of developing and implementing on say framework of standards, for instance, on AEO, free zones should be able to elevate if there is a compliance record for these new compliance programs like Safe Zone into AEOs as well, because that would attract the right type of companies that we talk about that has a compliance record, that are AEO already. And of course, there are many benefits you can use that is from examples around the world. The AEO programs of the European Union is a legacy program. I was there when we built it. It's 11, 12 years old. The programs that are there today in other countries, which also to some extent include then the opportunities like with free zones and warehousing and a number of other areas of customs legislation. There are 50, 60 benefits that is not used in the European Union that could be tested, scale tested within the framework of an AEO zone that has AEO inhabitants, for instance. And that means that you can actually create, and there was mentioned as well, the single trade window, very good opportunities for processing that could be tested in a free zone that has these requirements where there is transparency and where you use already established international standards. If you also do that with connecting it with other similar zones and hubs, then of course you both have the international trade perspective and you have the innovations and creative work that is done in that specific zone. Then you have the best of two worlds, and you can both create predictability, which is what private sector needs most of all. And secondly, you can also create the opportunities and new ways of having regulatory regimes there that are simplified, that makes decisions on what you're going to do with your goods later in the process in some extent, which again help you out as a trader. So there's many things you can do within the framework of this. And I agree with Shankar, we should be creative, innovative, and use examples from other places in the world, also in UK, and then take it to a new level. And that will everybody will do at the end of the day. And I think we should do it here as well.
Cool. And then Georgina quickly, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I'm always struck how sort of the UK, in fact, when you talk member states and you talk to member states, they say, you know, the UK was a really good driver of good EU policy and was really creative in that space. So I think it would be a shame for the government not to continue that and to show sort of what it would like to do differently and how it could do differently. As I said, I think consultation will be really important because again, free ports and free zones are not just about tariff exemptions. You know, there's the added bit about, you know, facilitated customs documentation. Well, what does that look like in practice? And I think if you really want these free zones to become innovative hubs, then you need to think more broadly about how it is that you stimulate economic activity, how you sort of create these new, you know, how do you ensure that they become creative rather than just a place where businesses decide to relocate because actually they can benefit from tax exemption. So I think there needs to be a lot of careful thinking about the regulatory environment in that way.
Okay, so the next question comes from Robert Muss, David Isherwood, Tony Smith, and Richard Heath, who have all, in various ways, addressed the issue, which again Shankar alluded to, of transparency and the fact that, you know, free zones have a reputation, perhaps unjustified, perhaps not, or as, you know, as shady places for shady people. And how do you you know, how do you ensure that you know, both the public can have confidence in what's happening in these places, and also you know, how do you ensure full stop that there is that the activity is all above the law? I mean, Frank, you alluded to this in your talk as well.
Sorry, maybe if I just do an initial response to that. So I think there's a number of levels here. First of all, it's very difficult to know to what degree there is, you know, challenges with some of the compliance, etc., within free ports. It's difficult to measure, but the ability for the new emerging technologies to take that head on and create that transparency will make a step change in addressing some of those challenges. That's not the only aspect, though. You know, as well as having confidence that we are really aware of what's coming in and how it's being treated and that it is compliant, etc. There is also, you know, the illegal behaviour, as it were, that uses even with the compliance that you know, that operates, etc. So we see that in all ports today. I mean, Antwerp at one point was, you know, subject to all sorts of drug trafficking issues because of buying operators within the ports and getting them to to cover the the tracks of goods and in a covert manner. So they were following processes, procedures, and complying. So there's a whole wealth of processes that need to be looked at here. And I think we wrote a Freeport consultation, and a significant part of that was how do you look at security within the port itself as well. And again, being a technologist, there are technology innovations that are very much here today and emerging. So our friends like smart cameras, smart devices that look for patterns, look for unusual behaviours across huge areas, are taking more and more, more and more credibility in the marketplace, becoming more effective. And drones. Now, drones are a little bit of a challenge when it comes to the ports because they tend to be windy places, but we mustn't underestimate that. And some ports are even using underwater drones to actually look at behaviours there as well. So there's a whole wealth of things we can do, but I don't think technology in itself is the answer. You still need strong legislation and a strong presence in the ports as well.
I should clarify for those who aren't familiar with the technicalities, special economic zones, just because they don't have tariffs doesn't mean they don't have laws. They are, you are still within the legal kind of ambit of the host country. Lars.
If I may, I think you're absolutely right. The problem that has been, because again, we all know that we talk about the global supply chain here, international integrated value chains. And free zones have, by definition, been very difficult to get into to be integrated in these zones because of the issues that we were talking about and the questions that were asked. And the problem has been we haven't segmented them. We have segmented every single part of the supply chain before based on compliance and risk. We haven't done that with free zones. There's no reason why we shouldn't. And that process, as I said, started 3-4 years ago. In my career, 35 years in customs, I saw free ports as a big problem and challenge. I don't do that anymore, because what we need to do and what is about to happen with these initiatives from World Free Zone Organization, OECD, and others, is that you actually segment zones. They're voluntary zones who would say, okay, I want to be transparent. I want to be a part of the supply chain, and they go voluntarily into compliance programs with a code of conduct that shows exactly bookkeeping, what is going on, what is going in and out, using the technology Frank is talking about. And when you show that standard, you can also get a certificate of proving that, but it's an ongoing process. And you have different type of whistleblower systems. There are magnificent ways of actually making sure that it is a transparent compliance zone. That in itself is an advantage, because you create then an offer and an opportunity for those who are compliant, want to be in a compliant environment, to actually go to that zone instead of another zone, make them more compatible and competitive. And that means, of course, that in itself, that will drive the process of removing these risks, because people actually go to the ones that are compliant, where you can do more of these things we are talking about that are benefits of zones. And this is not a vision for the future. It's already existing. These are programs like the Safe Zone, as I said, that already exists. And zones are starting to meet those requirements. And when they do, we will get the transparency and the compliance in the zones. And for me, of course, as working with what we are working with, that's great, because that means that traders can actually choose if they want to pay a little bit more to go into a zone that actually works better. But by the way, you also get more back from, more benefits from being a part of. Then, of course, you have an opportunity, you have an offer. And that will certainly, again, segment the zones based on risk, based on different things, and these indicators of compliance, and make them better. And that is where UK and many others should go. And that's how we create these trade superhighways that we talked about.
So quite a few questions in the UK context about trade, about about leakage. How do you avoid special zones or trade zones becoming sort of merely diverting activity to them? Although you might say that in the UK, diverting activity to these areas is kind of the point of it. I mean, Shanky, you touched on this in your remarks, making with your point about tilting the balance more towards regulatory incentives rather than just basically bribes to manufacturers.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, the more it's just about tax breaks, the more dislocative behaviour you're likely to get. And I think people have recognised. Like, I was interested to hear Lars making his comment about his view of special economic zones and free trade zones changing, because as a trade policy guy, for my whole career, you know, special economic zones and free trade zones were anathema. I mean, we did not want to see this sort of thing. We wanted countries to liberalize. We wanted countries to actually, you know, improve their regulatory environments and lower their distortions and barriers. But what we found was that actually it's very difficult for countries to do that quite often. And instead of being a barrier, an impediment to that, actually the special economic zone, free trade zone, sort of the broader concept, not the old sort of you know, industrial free trade zone with tax breaks, but the newer iteration of what they are, actually was helping countries, particularly some of the emerging markets and some of the developing countries. They were operating almost like alternative delivery mechanisms for reform and for development. So that's sort of the global picture. On the UK side, you know, there are lots of zones around the world that have experienced this same thing. I mean, they don't want to be rich, successful enclaves in very poor countries. So what they've done is look at ways in which the benefits of the economic activity can be spread to the local region or the country as a whole. And they've looked at things like creating healthcare trusts and education trusts, where, you know, so the gains from the economic activity that contribute to the increasing value of the land can be pushed into those sorts of trusts, either through shareholding or through public-private arrangements in terms of the governance structure of these zones, or through special purpose vehicles that involve the government having, the local area having some shareholding in the overall zones themselves. So there are lots of creative things that one can do to give the people who live in the surrounding area or even larger region a stake. What you want to do, if these are going to be successful, you have to give people a stake and a vested interest in their success. If you do that, then you've insulated them from any kind of, you know, attack that it's really just about companies trying to lower their costs. Not that there's anything wrong with companies seeking to lower their costs, but you insulate them from that sort of thinking, and you give them an opportunity, and you give the local surrounding region an opportunity to see this as a engine of growth, not only for the zone itself, but also for them. So I think but you have to be intentional about that. You can't just expect that to sort of happen. You have to develop structures and governance structures that allow that to occur.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? Oh, okay. We are rapidly running out of time. This is genuinely like the kind of biggest load of questions compared to available time that I've had when doing one of these things. So obviously people are very interested in this indeed. So I'm going to sort of fire out a few thoughts which have come on from the Q&A and see if people want to respond. Firstly, to anonymous attendee who asks about airports as opposed to ports. Yes, airports can be free trade zones. The world's largest free trade zone is in fact around Geneva Airport, which is famously landlocked, and also famously has, you know, a very large chunk of the world's artistic treasures locked up inside it. A question from James Hayward of the Centre for Policy Studies: are we focusing too much on goods, not services? Question from someone about how this ties in with charter cities, which is an interesting idea. And a couple of questions about the EU negotiations and Northern Ireland and how this ties in with that, and in particular. There's someone suggesting, you know, couldn't you flip the idea on its head and have a free zone with more regulation in mirroring the EU's to help sort of address some of the issues there? I mean, I think, Georgina, that's possibly something the IFG is wearily familiar with as a discussion topic. But if any of those spark thoughts in any of the panelists, please do speak up.
Well, if I can just sort of pick up some of those goods and services, yes, absolutely, we should focus on services. And you know, whenever goods are traded, it's sometimes forgotten that the barrier between what is a good and what is a service is a pretty blurred line quite often. And there are certainly a lot of services that attend goods trade. So what you would expect to see in these zones and in the free ports in the UK would be an explosion of services around the goods trade, just as you've seen in many other places where you start off with a pure customs logistics kind of operation, and then you build trade finance off the back of that, then you build other financial services products off the back of that, and lo and behold, you have a financial services zone, or you have a financial model with everything else, with the business and the legal and the accounting services that go alongside that. So sometimes you can't really separate them. With respect to the Northern Ireland Protocol, well, I think Lars and I are doing quite a lot of work in this area together. Nothing in the Northern Ireland Protocol, nothing in the EU law prevents a free trade zone operating. You may have some issues in terms of agreement on regulatory type of stuff. But the other point about the protocol is very important. I think sometimes this is not well understood and it's sort of lost in translation. Is that what the protocol does is it imposes the UCC, the European the Union Customs Code, on Northern Ireland, insofar as GB/NI movements implicate EU trade, i.e. for goods at risk, and depending on how the Joint Committee defines what at risk is. So this does not preclude a free trade zone or a free port in Northern Ireland from benefiting from the free ports programme and from, in fact, being very, very successful in their operations to reach not only other markets around the world, but also the EU via Ireland itself. And on charter cities, I mean, obviously, Paul Romer did a lot of work on charter cities. That his concept recognized that the regulatory issues were incredibly important. His solution was essentially to take the Swedish law and apply the Swedish law into a country. And so in Honduras, for example, you would have Swedish law applying inside the charter city. I'm not sure that's entirely feasible. However, there are many countries that have adopted elements of English common law, and it's not just modern zones that have done this. If you look at Singapore itself, you know, it's taken English common law as its sort of legal basis and led to an explosion of economic growth there. So, and let's not forget that the original charter city is in fact the City of London, the City of London Corporation, with its ancient rights and privileges from the time of you know, William the Conqueror had to accept these ancient rights and privileges when he invaded the country, and Magna Carta specifically refers to the ancient rights and privileges of the City of London. So this concept of a sort of quotes charter city has been around for a long, long time. And the idea, the core of the idea, is that you can improve the regulatory environment of the zone vis-a-vis the rest of the country.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shankar. Can we go around the other panelists and also sort of offer any closing remarks in the process? We'll probably overrun by 5 minutes or so, but I hope you can forgive that. Georgina, why not?
I probably need to think a little bit more about sort of free zone and Northern Ireland and everything else. But I think the broader point I'd like to make, which is one I made in my opening remarks, is, you know, when you're thinking about free ports, you can't think about them in isolation. There's a lot, you know, the sort of the UK's trade negotiations, how that interacts, and also obviously the EU negotiations. I think, as we know, trade isn't just about tariffs, low tariffs, tariff exemptions, or, you know, custom declarations. It is actually all about the non-tariff barriers as well. So, you know, simplification of custom declarations. It's trying to reduce time at borders, etc. So I think there are important questions. I don't know on Northern Ireland specifically and how that relates, but I think it's not really a question. When I sort of talk to my EU like colleagues or contacts, they don't really raise free ports that often, in fact, at all in our discussions. So I think sort of it will really depend on sort of what the UK leaving the transition period, what its relationship is with the EU going forward, and the impact in certain sectors. So I mentioned manufacturing, you know, 10% of the UK economy highly integrated with a single market. You know, that sort of impact cannot be offset purely with new initiatives, but that certainly shouldn't prevent us from thinking about them. And I think in terms of sort of making sure free ports are innovative hubs, I think a lot of that's got to do with sort of attracting, you know, research, thinking of good research systems, you know, creating an innovation-friendly environment and all of the rest that goes with it. And I think I was particularly struck, Lars, when you were mentioning about sort of some of the examples of and how free ports have evolved. So I would be really interested if you had sort of like an example that you think we should follow, or the UK should be closely emulated, perhaps.
Well, Cue Lars.
Thank you very much. No, I think that first of all, for Northern Ireland, the Ireland situation, of course, there's an opportunity there as well. Overall, I think that we are now starting to addressing, as I've said several times as well, the issues that has been a challenge and a problem around free zones. And if UK, as an example, and many others outside UK as well, and I also think in European Union for our side actually looking at this as the combination that we've been talking about as a vehicle for innovation, as a vehicle for different types of developments. And there are, as I said, many zones that has been doing this already. And you will find them in places that is not the usual suspect, and not only often only in the places that are the development hubs. So there's very interesting free zones of this kind in Colombia, for instance. There are in some places in the Middle East. Not all the zones in the Middle East have the same level of integrity and compliance, and these drives around services, specialization, and so forth that we talked about. But it's very much, and I want to highlight that, as Eugenia said as well, about non-tariff barriers. Things we are trying to develop and trying to get into through trade facilitation in different means with registration systems and AOs and all of these, things that are there, has developed faster outside European Union and Europe than in Europe. And there are reasons for that as well. That takes a long time to explain, but we all know about them. And I think that that's where the opportunity is, where these zones that we work with today all around the world, where we also see a connection into trading companies for e-commerce, for instance, which is a totally different topic, but it's again linked into free zones as opportunity zones, where if you have transparency, if you have compliance, if you have integrity in the zones with code of conducts and a transparent way of monitoring and managing that, it creates wonderful opportunities of this kind. But it needs to be on that level, and I think that that's the best advice I would go away with from this specific session, that there is an opportunity here for UK to take the forefront here, to learn from the best zones that are there, and the best examples. You can never, as in any capacity building issue, actually find something and copy paste it. What you need to do is develop it, as Shanker said before, from the environment you're in. But I think that there are elements there that could take UK and the UK zones very much to the forefront of this development, and doing that would actually have a chance of already making the recovery of the economy much better. There's no need for extra energy here. The energy is already in these zones and in these nodes and in these superhighways. Technology is there to make them safe and secure. So let's use that energy correctly. Thank you.
And Frank, any closing thoughts?
Just very quickly, yes. On the topic of Northern Ireland, I think obviously the imperative there is how we square that circle of the Northern Ireland protocols in such a way that Northern Ireland as a region is able to continue to trade as unhindered as possible into both the EU and the UK. Once we've managed to get through that agenda, then I think there's a very strong case for the promotion of free ports in that region to further accelerate its opportunities in terms of boosting trade and the economy, because it's very well placed to move into both UK and GB and EU trading regions. And of course, it's not just a Northern Ireland benefit. Then we've seen questions about does free trade zones keep the do they spread the growth and the benefits? This is a situation where it absolutely needs to, and it needs to do that for the whole of the island of Ireland as well, and something that can be promoted. So I think there's a strong case for that to be looked at as well.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists for a fascinating conversation which could have gone on a lot longer. I'm especially indebted to Frank for giving me perhaps the first concrete example of how blockchain is making the world a genuine better place already, rather than just resulting in endless bloody press releases from slightly spivvy operations who have proclaiming how it can be used to cure cancer or whatever the latest thing is. But no, thank you all so very, very much. I'm sure there is a lot more to do on this agenda, but it was really encouraging to hear from such experts, and to hear about the fact that we do seem to be moving from a sort of high level talk about should we do free trade to how do we make our trade freer, to actually trying to solve those problems. So thank you all very, very much.